In a landmark moment for South Korea, the Constitutional Court has delivered a unanimous verdict. All 8 justices have upheld the impeachment of President Yoon Suk Yeol. With this ruling, Yoon becomes only the 2nd president in the nation's history to be removed from office. At the heart of the decision, his December 3rd martial law declaration and 5 key actions reviewed by the court. It found that he declared martial law without meeting the legal requirements, drafted a martial law decree, mobilized troops to the National Assembly, ordered an operation at the National Election Commission, and attempted to detain sitting lawmakers. The court recognized all 5 actions as exceeding constitutional limits and that this was grounds for removal. Effective immediately, executive power shifts to Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. A presidential election must now be held within 60 days by June 3rd. Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea's Constitutional Court's unanimous ruling to remove President Yoon Suk Yeol from office has now set the country on a new constitutional path. With executive power transferred and a presidential election looming, the country faces a critical period of transition and reflection. To help us unpack the legal foundations of the court's decision and what it means for the presidency and the rule of law moving forward, we're pleased to welcome attorney An Jun-seong back in the studio with us.
Good evening.
Thank you for joining us. And we're also connect online to Lee Hee-eun, Dean and Professor of Law at Handong Int'l Law School. Great to see you, Professor.
It's a pleasure to be with you all.
And also today we invite Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's begin our discussion right away. Attorney An, so the Constitutional Court ruled to uphold the impeachment case against President Yoon Suk Yeol. What do you think were the key constitutional principles or legal standards that has guided the court's ruling?
Interesting, because recently I reviewed the Korean constitutional law, and something came across my mind: the separation of power, aka the check and balance. And as you know, the Korean government consists of 3 separate branches, the executive branch and legislative branch and the judiciary branch. And based on today's ruling, I think that court message is do not cross the line. And any actions or even attempts to cross the line is a serious constitutional violation, which justifies presidential removal. And as for the legal standard, I think that is important to mention what kind of legal standard KCC uses today. And I think that unlike the criminal litigation, which used a beyond a reasonable doubt standard, and the KCC uses a balancing test, which weight multiple factors in a legal case. So today, the court applied the balancing test and concluded that the benefit of protecting the Constitution by removing a sitting president outweighed the national cost resulting from such a removal. So I think that's a clear message sent by the KCC today.
Right. So the court really grounded its decision in constitutional boundaries on executive power, of course. Now to Professor Lee, could you elaborate for us what were the likely constitutional violations that the court has identified today?
Right. So the court identified 5 areas where President Yoon violated the Constitution, and the first one being his decision itself to declare martial law. The court there identified basically a substantive problem as well as a procedural problem as well. So substantively speaking, there was really, according to the court, no basis to declare martial law, because martial law is usually declared in a situation of a national emergency, like a war or some sort of disaster. And so the court found that there were no such conditions for the actual declaration itself. So substantively speaking, martial law was being declared improperly, as well as procedurally those problems, because the proper procedures in terms of the state council, in terms of informing necessary members of the cabinet to have a discussion and then have the decision made by the president was not followed. And then we go to the next question about deployment of the military to the National Assembly. And that's really a claim of obstruction, which the court found to be the obstruction of the business of the National Assembly, that you can't send troops to the National Assembly to stop them from doing their constitutional duties. So that was a serious violation. And then, of course, the martial law proclamation itself, the court found deficiencies in the actual substance of the declaration. And then fourth, the search and seizure that took place in the National Election Commission. And there the court said there had to be a warrant in order for the Election Commission to be searched and items to be seized. And so the fact that there was no warrant given was a really serious problem. And lastly, the attempt to locate certain legal officers and the identification of maybe identifying judges, former judges that were sought to be arrested was incredible to the court's view that the executive branch could seek out officers to be arrested in the context of martial law. So in conclusion, essentially, as Professor An mentioned here, he went beyond the scope of his authority, and the court determined that all of these violations, these five, resulted in a serious violation which justified removing him from the presidency.
Right, so that does indeed highlight the seriousness of the violations, especially when all 8 justices agreed unanimously. Let's also touch upon the reactions. Dr. Klingner, how is President Yoon's impeachment ruling being viewed in Washington, particularly among U.S. policymakers, intelligence circles, or even defense analysts?
Well, the verdict announcement came in overnight here in Washington time, so we haven't seen an official U.S. government reaction. I think virtually all Korea watchers expected that the Constitutional Court would uphold the impeachment resolution, so there's not a great deal of surprise amongst Korea watchers. The U.S. government has been very careful to not give any indication that it was interfering in internal affairs of South Korea. So I think the next announcement will be very consistent with those that were issued before, acknowledging that South Korea's constitutional system prevailed, that it continued, and that the court's ruling is a continuation of that constitutional process. So there will also be a strong affirmation that regardless of who is elected in the special election, the overall relationship, and particularly the military alliance, will continue, that the U.S. has an ironclad commitment to the defense of South Korea and is a strong partner. Now, overshadowing that is the announcement yesterday of the tariffs, which certainly impacted South Korea along with every other nation, and also the continued uncertainty about what the Trump administration's policies toward the Indo-Pacific region will be. We haven't seen a lot of details about that yet, but in Washington, the main focus will be on the impact of the tariffs on Wall Street as well as overall business.
Right, so we will have to see until South Korea elects its new leadership in the coming months. Now, what about in other countries, Dr. Klingner? How might regional actors like North Korea, China, or Japan interpret the ruling? Do you think it could shift perceptions of South Korean political stability or resolve?
I think the announcement, and particularly the muted reaction by President Yoon and the ruling party, as well as the nonviolence that in the streets, will really affirm to other nations that the constitutional process is very strong in South Korea, and that there really is no way for other countries to take advantage of what has been several months of political turmoil. North Korea was largely muted in its comments, is sort of following an adage attributed to Napoleon of don't stop your opponent when he's making a mistake. So they could sort of revel in the political turmoil of South Korea, but certainly they weren't going to take a military advantage of it. So I think there'll be an acknowledgement, but there'll be predictable criticism by North Korea about South Korea, but really I don't think there is going to have a very large comment.
Mm-hmm. Now let's face back into the next, what's going to happen next. Attorney An, what are the immediate constitutional and legal procedures that follow the court's decision now?
Yes, pursuant to Article 68 of the Korean constitutional law, there will be a 6-day window to elect a new president. And as you know, the 6 days is pretty short, right? It's a very hectic schedule to follow. And in terms of the other litigation, well, criminal trial, for example, and although the insurrection charge is based on the same fact, and means that AKA the December 3rd, martial law declaration, we cannot prejudge the criminality at this moment, and means that we must wait and see how the case will, how it develops in the future, in the coming months, because that they apply the different, set of rules applied, also different standard of review applied. And so again, there's beyond a reasonable doubt means that the prosecutor have to prove it. The 99.9999 or more, or almost 100% to prove that former President Yoon Suk Yeol violated the criminal law. That's very heavy burden to prove.
Right. So 60 days legally, we're entering a really tightly timed transition.
Yes.
And also politically, all eyes are now turned to June's election as well as Yoon's legal fate. So speaking of this, Dr. Klingner, South Korea will now have to hold a new presidential election within 60 days. We're kind of watching on June 3rd. How might this sudden leadership transition affect the ongoing U.S. ROK diplomatic or security coordination?
Well, it will continue to postpone a summit meeting between President Trump and the South Korean leader. But below that level, there's been an ongoing government-to-government actions. The alliance managers, the diplomats, even at the Secretary of State level and Secretary of Defense level, have been continuing. So the relationship is quite strong. Now, because the ruling and opposition parties have very different views on foreign and security policies, that certainly will impact the eventual South Korean president's relationship with Trump. A PPP leader would be very much aligned with President Trump on strong actions against China, but would likely see strong differences on the approach to North Korea, whereas a DPK president would likely clash with President Trump on not wanting to be so strong on policy against China, but would welcome President Trump's desire for re-engaging with Kim Jong-un. So depending on who is elected, I think it will, overall the relationship will be strong, but there will be differences of view and perhaps strains in the relationship on various security and foreign policy issues.
Right. So we still don't know still don't have an idea of who will be elected, but a close communication would definitely be critical in ties. Now, let's also go back to the past. Attorney An, now that the procedures of President Yoon's impeachment case has been finished, how do you think this ruling compares to previous impeachment decisions involving Presidents Roh Moo-hyun and Park Geun-hye in terms of legal reasoning or the scope of the presidential authority?
Yes. Actually, I think that the court applied the same balancing test to Park Geun-hye and Yoon Suk Yeol impeachment cases, which means that the court tested whether the benefit of protecting the constitution by removing the sitting president is outweighs the national cost resulting from it. So, and court found it so, and that's the things happening here. And also, I think that one of the messages is of separation of power or check and balance issues that court specifically mentioned that there is a separation balance, check and balance principle. And that means that three government branches are legally independent and separate, right? So separate, not only separate, but also is independent. I think that means that they supposed to be, they check each other to check from, and then they are separate from each other. So, and then to strike the kind of a structural balance among the three branches. So this kind of big picture is that the constitutional court focused on the, some separation of power issue and didn't really talk specific. Well, I think that the specific details on in what case the president can exercise kind of power is more important to see the big picture about the core focus on separation of power principle. I think that's the really key message.
So speaking of check and balance, Professor Lee, as impeachment rulings are final and are not really subject to appeal, I wonder if there are discussions in the legal community about whether these high-impact decisions should involve any form of, post-decision review or any institutional check. What's your thoughts?
Well, not particularly, given that this was basically a unanimous decision and there were no dissents. I mean, the thought of adding an extra layer of review on top of the Constitutional Court's decision, I think, is not being seriously considered. Because under the Constitution of Korea, this is Article 111, the Constitutional Court, the Constitution specifically authorizes and gives exclusive jurisdiction to impeachment to the Constitutional Court. And so I think what we've seen here is because the court has come up with a decision and it went through a process of hearing the evidence and then coming to a decision, is, I think, speaks for itself. But also, just if you think about in comparison to other countries, let's say, for example, in the United States, where impeachment is really held within the context of the Congress, the legislative branch, which of course can impeach the president, and the Senate can convict and remove the president. Here in Korea, actually, we have a greater separation because we have the National Assembly that brings the articles of impeachment, but then the court, the judicial branch, actually can remove the president. So as far as an additional layer of review, I think what we have in Korea actually provides for potentially better safeguards when it comes to the issues of impeachment of the president. So I don't think there's any serious discussion among anyone here in Korea that there needs to be another layer of review above and beyond the Constitutional Court.
Right, so it's a reminder that finality brings both clarity and pressure. Now that the President Yoon has been removed from office, Professor Lee, he no longer holds presidential immunity, and he will stand trial on charges of insurrection, like Attorney An has mentioned a while ago, and his trial begins on April 14th. What do you think will be the most critical point of contention?
Right. So here we have the crime of treason or insurrection, and that's Article 87 of the Criminal Act. And so formally, if anyone causes or creates violence for the purpose of usurping national territory or subverting the Constitution, is guilty of insurrection. And so here we have previous examples of the criminal courts or the courts themselves upholding convictions of former presidents, and this is Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo, who they were basically convicted of insurrection, and including in that, and most notably because we're thinking about this trial for President Yoon. Blockading or obstructing the National Assembly was seen to be an act that could rise to the level of insurrection. And so I think this doesn't necessarily bode well for former President Yoon when it comes to his criminal trial, because in this case, because there have been other instances where presidents have been tried and found guilty of insurrection. So basically, I think the main question will be in his criminal trial is whether or not his attempt to neutralize the National Assembly during the process of the martial law imposition really represents an attempt to have an insurrection. And I think that will be the main focus of the criminal trial against President Yoon.
So his attempt to neutralize the National Assembly, that will be the key in the next legal arena. So now the issue of constitutional reform has also been highlighted following President Yoon's impeachment trial. Attorney An, from a legal standpoint, how might the impeachment process influence future discussions on constitutional amendments or presidential emergency powers?
Well, as Professor Lee mentioned, right? So we've different from U.S. system, and now it's brought back to the National Assembly. So constitutional amendment is to be made by by the Congress or the National Assembly, not by the judiciary branch. So, however, for the constitutional amendment, you need based on the Constitution, you need a supermajority, which is 2/3 of the vote at the National Assembly, which is quite different story to discuss, right? So we'll have to wait and see how the National Assembly work on it, and we need to go see, check it out, the nature and the scope of the amendment, if anything happens. And for the president emergency power, I think that I do not expect any substantive change in the near future. And today, and the court actually basically, saying that they found a substantive and procedural violation to the provision. So there's a, constitutional amendment is possible, but it's quite a long way to go because, we haven't spent, well, I think we've been for a long time, decades, right, to change, make any change to the Constitution, but it's not an easy task.
Right. So all of these, given that all of these happenings have, actually dealt a big blow to South Korea's international credibility, Dr. Klingner, what kind of steps do you think South Korea could take to restore diplomatic trust and also reassure key allies, Washington in particular?
While the initial reaction in Washington to the martial law was a surprise in a sense that mature democracies do not engage in declaring martial law. But really, two areas that longtime Korea watchers emphasized as we were waiting for this ruling was that the constitutional system prevailed, that it was continuing, that democratization had taken very strong hold in South Korea, that there was very strong difference from previous instances of martial law, so that the process was working and that South Korea should be commended for that. We also emphasized that the U.S. and South Korea have gone through, good times and bad times together, and the relationship and the alliance always prevailed. So even as we were uncertain as to what the Constitutional Court would finally rule, the relationship continued, the government-to-government relations continued. So, moving forward during this interim 60-day period, the current government will continue to do what they have done, is reaching out to Washington, trying to discern what the Trump administration's policies towards the Indo-Pacific region will be, whether it prioritizes a China threat to Taiwan over the North Korean threat to South Korea. But everything is continuing to work. Once a new South Korean president is selected, then he will want to reach out and try to have a summit meeting with President Trump. But certainly his new administration will also want to establish their relations with the U.S. administration. So the system is working, not only the constitutional system in South Korea, but the government-to-government relations between Seoul and Washington.
Right. So despite these concerns, there are, once South Korea finds a new leadership, there would be more ways to engage in dialogue with Washington. Now, looking ahead, Professor Lee, what do you believe is the most important constitutional or institutional lesson South Korea should take away from this months-long impeachment trial, both for the presidency and for the health of the country's democracy as well?
Well, I think clearly the biggest lesson to be learned, or at least what's been highlighted here, is the strength of the rule of law and obviously the checks and balances that are critical to a mature democracy. If you think about it, Korea's democracy by comparison to other countries is not very old. And so the fact that you can have a peaceful transition of power in such a way where a president is forced out, and this is not through an election, but a legal process was used to remove a president, I think is quite astounding, given the fact that in other countries, this could certainly devolve into chaos and political instability when you have such a power vacuum that's created by this situation. But I think what we've seen is in the streets anyway, civil disobedience has been at a very minimum, and no one expects this to create internal chaos that would lead to some sort of political instability and really a devolution in terms of Korea's system. So I think the great lesson to be learned here, and I think this is a testament to the strength of Korea's democracy, is that despite the crisis that was created in this situation, Korea was able to respond with stability, with respect for the rule of law, and respect for the democratic institutions which have been established. So I think from that perspective, of course, Korea should be commended, and the Korean people should be commended for their actions during this whole crisis and the trial that took place.
Mm-hmm. A defining moment for Korea, and also a reminder that democracy is measured not just by elections, but also by how power is held to account and also the voices of the public. Now, this brings us to a close. Many thanks to Attorney An.
My pleasure.
Professor Lee. And of course,
thanks for having me.
And of course, Dr. Klingner, for sharing your valuable insights this evening. We truly appreciate all of your time and expertise. And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.